A tired father walks into a hotel with his sleeping daughter, and two front desk staff decide in a single glance that he doesn't deserve their help. What they don't know is that he owns the entire building. Stay till the end, because what happens next on StorySphere will remind you why kindness always matters, even when no one is watching. There is a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a person's shoulders after a long flight with a sleeping child. It is not simply physical exhaustion, though there is plenty of that, the stiffness from holding a small body still for hours, the dull ache that travels from the neck down through the back. It is something else too. A tenderness, a vigilance that does not turn off, even when everything around you suggests it could. It was that particular tiredness that Marcus Whitfield carried with him through the revolving doors of the Aldridge Grand Hotel on a Thursday evening in early November, his daughter Sophie asleep against his shoulder, a small bouquet of red roses held carefully in his free hand, the stems gripped low so the blooms would not brush against her sleeping face. He had bought the roses at the airport in the last few minutes before his flight, because tomorrow was the anniversary of his wife's passing, and he had decided, somewhere over Ohio, that he was not going to let the day arrive without flowers in the house. Some traditions survive grief by sheer stubbornness. This was one of his. He walked toward the front desk slowly, careful with each step, the way a parent learns to walk, when waking a child is the only thing in the world they are trying to avoid. Marcus Whitfield was 40 years old. He had dark, slightly unruly hair that no amount of professional grooming ever fully tamed, and a beard that suggested several days of travel rather than careful cultivation. He wore a brown leather jacket, worn soft at the elbows, the kind of jacket that had been broken in over years, rather than purchased to look that way. Slung across his body was a leather messenger bag, heavy with the particular chaos that accompanies traveling with a small child, snacks, a tablet, a spare change of clothes, a stuffed bear with one ear slightly more loved than the other. Sophie, 6 years old, slept against his shoulder with the complete and unguarded trust that children carry before the world has taught them to be careful. Her pink jacket was rumpled from the flight. Her dark hair, braided that morning into 2 braids, had come half undone on one side. She held the stuffed bear loosely in one arm, her small hand resting against the leather of her father's jacket. To anyone observing the scene from across the lobby, they would have looked like exactly what they were, a tired father traveling alone with his daughter, arriving somewhere late, and hoping for nothing more complicated than a bed. What the lobby did not know, what Marcus had no particular reason to announce, because announcing it had never been the point, was that he owned the building they were standing in. The Aldridge Grand was the 7th property in a small, carefully built hospitality group that Marcus had started 11 years earlier, before Sophie was born, before his wife Elena had gotten sick, before the world had rearranged itself into the shape it now held. He did not run the day-to-day operations of any single property. He had people for that, regional managers, hotel directors, a small executive team that handled what needed handling. But he made it a quiet, unannounced practice to visit his own properties from time to time, unrecognized, dressed exactly as he was dressed now, not as a test, not as a trap, but because he had learned, over the years, that the only way to understand how a place actually treated people was to be treated as an ordinary person yourself. He approached the front desk. 2 women stood behind it. The first was tall, blonde, her hair pulled into a neat low bun, wearing a navy blazer with a brass name tag that read Claire. Her arms were crossed loosely, and her eyes moved over Marcus with a quick, assessing glance that took in the leather jacket, the sleeping child, the bouquet of roses, and arrived at a conclusion before he had said a single word. Beside her stood a second woman in a cream blazer, dark hair loose around her shoulders, arms also crossed, watching with an expression that mirrored her colleagues, not hostile exactly, but guarded, in a way that suggested she had already decided what kind of evening this was going to be. "Good evening," Marcus said quietly, careful not to raise his voice and wake Sophie. "I have a reservation. Whitfield. Just checking in for the night." Claire's eyes moved to the computer screen in front of her, then back to Marcus. "I'm not seeing a reservation under that name," she said. "It should be there," Marcus said. "It may have been booked through corporate. Could you check again?" There was a pause, the particular pause of someone deciding how much effort a request deserves, before they've even finished hearing it. "Sir," Claire said, "even if there were a reservation issue, we're fully booked this evening. There's a corporate event upstairs. I'm afraid we don't have anything available." Marcus shifted Sophie slightly, careful not to wake her. "I understand you're busy," he said, "but I'd really appreciate it if you could look a little more carefully. It's been a long flight, and my daughter needs to sleep somewhere that isn't an airport chair." It was the kind of moment that reveals something true about a person, not because the words spoken are dramatic, but because of the small choices made in an unguarded instant, the tone selected, the level of effort offered, the willingness or unwillingness to simply look again. Claire glanced at her colleague. Something passed between them, not spoken but understood, the way unkindness sometimes moves between people without ever needing language. "I really am sorry," Claire said in a tone that did not sound sorry at all, "but there's simply nothing we can do. You might try the Marriott 2 blocks over." The second woman, whose name tag read Renata, added, not unkindly in tone but carelessly in effect, "Sometimes this time of year walk-ins just don't work out. I'd recommend calling ahead next time." Now here's where it gets interesting. Before you keep watching, hit that subscribe button on StorySphere, because what this quiet hotel housekeeper does next is the moment this whole story turns around. Marcus stood there for a moment. He was not angry, not yet, and not in the way the moment might have suggested he should be. He had built his career, in part, on a simple principle he had learned long before he owned a single building, that you could often learn more about a person's character by watching how they treated someone who appeared to need nothing from them, than by watching how they treated someone who clearly held power. He was, at this moment, a tired man in a worn jacket, holding his sleeping daughter and a bouquet of roses, and to Claire and Renata, that was apparently all he was. He shifted Sophie's weight again. She stirred slightly, murmured something into his shoulder, and settled back into sleep. "Is there a manager I could speak with?" he asked quietly. "The manager is currently occupied with the event upstairs," Claire said. "I really can't interrupt him for a room availability question. As I said, we're full." It was at this point, while Marcus stood quietly considering his next step, that a third person appeared from a side door near the concierge desk. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and silver-streaked dark hair pulled back simply, wearing the burgundy vest of the hotel's housekeeping supervisors. Her name tag read Dolores. She had been walking past with an armful of fresh linens, when she noticed the scene at the front desk, the sleeping child, the roses, the tired set of the father's shoulders, and the particular stiffness in the body language of the two women behind the counter. She set the linens down on a nearby luggage cart and approached. "Excuse me," she said gently to Marcus, not to her colleagues. "Is everything all right?" Marcus looked at her. There was something in her face, an open, unhurried attentiveness, that was entirely absent from the desk in front of him. "I have a reservation that doesn't seem to be coming up," he said, "and I'm told the hotel is full." Dolores glanced at the front desk computer, then at Claire. "Did you check the corporate block?" she asked. "Sometimes reservations made through the executive office don't show in the standard search. You have to look under the secondary tab." Claire's expression flickered, irritation quickly suppressed. "I checked the system. There's nothing." "Did you check the secondary tab?" Dolores said again, more firmly this time, the gentleness in her voice not disappearing, but acquiring a clear edge underneath it. There was a pause. Claire clicked through the screen with visible reluctance. A moment passed. Her face changed. "There's a reservation here," she said slowly. "Whitfield. Under the executive booking category." "I thought there might be," Dolores said simply. But Dolores was not finished. She turned fully to look at Marcus, really look at him the way she had clearly been trained or had simply decided on her own, to look at every person who walked through the doors of wherever she worked. She saw the roses. "Those are beautiful," she said softly. "Is tomorrow a special day?" Marcus looked down at the flowers in his hand, slightly crushed now from the long flight, but still holding their color. "It's the anniversary," he said quietly, "of my wife. She passed 3 years ago tomorrow. We always," he paused, adjusting Sophie against his shoulder, "we always put flowers out. It's become our tradition." Sophie picks the vase. Dolores' expression softened, in a way that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. "I'm so sorry," she said. And then, looking at Sophie's sleeping face pressed against her father's shoulder, the small hand curled around the worn stuffed bear. "She's beautiful. She looks exhausted, poor thing." "It's been a long day for both of us," Marcus admitted. Dolores looked at the bouquet again, then reached out gently, asking permission with her eyes before her hands moved, and adjusted one of the rose stems that had bent awkwardly during the flight, the way a person fixes something small, simply because they notice it needs fixing, and they are the kind of person who fixes small things without being asked. "Let me find you a vase before you go up," she said. "You shouldn't have to carry these bent like that all the way to your room." It was a small gesture. It would not have made the news. It would not have been remarkable in almost any other context. But Marcus Whitfield, who had spent 11 years building a company around a simple principle, that hospitality is not a department, it is a character trait, and you cannot train it into someone who does not already carry the instinct, felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt since walking through the revolving doors. Someone finally had seen him. Not the reservation. Not the inconvenience of a late check-in. Him, tired, grieving, traveling alone with his daughter, holding roses for a wife who was no longer there to receive them. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind." "It's nothing," Dolores said, already turning to retrieve a vase from behind the concierge desk. "It's the least this place can do after keeping you standing here so long." She said the last part loudly enough that Claire and Renata both heard it clearly. What happened next unfolded the way these things sometimes do, not through anger but through simple, unavoidable clarity. Marcus checked in. The reservation, once properly located, was confirmed, a suite on the 9th floor, booked weeks earlier through his own corporate office, the kind of routine booking that should never have required this much difficulty to locate. But before he went upstairs, he asked quietly to see the hotel's general manager. Not in anger, but because he believed, as he always had, that patterns of behavior were worth understanding before they were corrected. The general manager, a composed man named Gregory Sandoval, arrived within minutes, apologetic and visibly anxious the moment he recognized the name on the registration screen. He had worked for Marcus's company for 6 years, had met Marcus exactly twice at regional meetings, and clearly had not expected to encounter his employer, standing tired and travel-worn in his own lobby, with a sleeping child and a bouquet of roses. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I had no idea you were. I'm terribly sorry for the confusion at the desk. I'll address it immediately." Marcus held up a hand gently. "I'd like to talk to you about what just happened. Not as an executive correcting his staff, just as a guest who was treated unkindly tonight, for no reason other than the way I happened to look when I walked in." He told Gregory, plainly and without exaggeration, what had occurred, the dismissiveness, the unwillingness to check twice, the suggestion to simply go elsewhere rather than do the small additional work of looking properly. And then he told him about Dolores and the vase and the kindness that had cost her nothing, but had meant, in that tired moment, almost everything. "I'm not asking you to fire anyone in anger," Marcus said. "I'm asking you to think about what kind of hotel we're actually running, if the woman who restocks linens understands hospitality better than the people standing at the front desk." Gregory Sandoval did, in the end, let Claire and Renata go, not as an act of cruelty and not that same night, but after a careful review the following week, that confirmed what Marcus had already suspected, that this had not been an isolated lapse, but a pattern documented in more than one prior guest complaint, that had been quietly absorbed and forgotten, the way small unkindnesses sometimes are, when no one with sufficient standing happens to notice them. It was not really about the termination in the end. Marcus did not take satisfaction in it. He had built his company on the belief that people generally rise to the standard they are shown, and he felt, in some private way, that the failure belonged at least partly to the systems that had allowed 2 employees to treat a tired father so carelessly, without consequence, for as long as they apparently had. What mattered more to him, what he thought about, in fact, far more often in the weeks that followed, was Dolores. He found her 2 days later, before he checked out, in the small break room behind the housekeeping office, eating a sandwich during her short lunch window. "Dolores," he said, knocking gently on the open door. Do you have a minute? She looked up, surprised to see him, and immediately began to stand, smoothing her vest. Mr. Whitfield, I didn't realize. Please, he said. Sit. I just wanted to thank you properly for the other night. She sat back down, looking faintly embarrassed, the way kind people often do when their kindness is noticed and named directly. It was nothing, she said. I just don't like seeing people treated like that. Especially not a father traveling alone with a little one. I raised 3 kids by myself after my husband passed. I know what that kind of tired looks like. Marcus nodded slowly. I didn't know that, he said. Not many people ask, Dolores said simply without bitterness, just as a fact about how these things tend to go. He sat down across from her. I'd like to ask you something, he said. I'm restructuring our regional training program, the one that teaches new hires what hospitality actually means beyond the script. I think you'd be very good at helping design it. Actually, I think you'd be better at it than most of the people currently doing the job. Dolores blinked. I clean rooms, Mr. Whitfield. I'm not a trainer. You saw a tired man and a sleeping child and a bent flower stem, Marcus said, and you fixed all 3 things without being asked in about 90 seconds, while 2 trained desk staff stood 3 feet away and saw nothing at all. That's not a small skill. That's the entire skill. I'd like to pay you properly to teach it to other people. Dolores accepted after several days of careful consideration, and one long phone call with her oldest daughter, who told her in no uncertain terms that she would be a fool to turn down what was being offered. She became, within the year, the regional training coordinator for guest experience across all 7 of Marcus's properties, a role that did not exist before that November evening, built specifically around what she had already been doing quietly, without title or recognition for years. She kept, on her office wall, a small framed photograph, not of the hotel, not of any award, but of a simple glass vase holding a bouquet of slightly crushed red roses, which Marcus had sent to her, along with a card, the week after Sophie's mother's anniversary had passed. The card read simply, "Thank you for seeing us when it would have been so easy not to." Sophie, for her part, remembered very little of that particular evening. She had been asleep for most of it after all, and children carry their memories selectively, holding on to warmth and releasing detail. But she remembered, in the vague way that young children remember important things without understanding why they are important. A kind woman with silver-streaked hair, who had fixed a flower for her daddy, and who had smiled at her briefly, while she pretended to still be asleep against her father's shoulder. Years later, when Sophie was older and beginning to understand more fully the kind of man her father was, the quiet, unannounced way he moved through the world, checking on the things that mattered rather than simply trusting the reports that crossed his desk, she would ask him once why that particular evening had stayed with him so clearly, out of so many nights of travel. And Marcus would tell her, simply, that it was the night he had learned all over again, something he had always believed but had needed to be reminded of, that kindness rarely announces itself with fanfare. It comes quietly in someone noticing a bent flower stem, or a tired set of shoulders, or a sleeping child who deserves a bed rather than a lobby chair. And that the people who offer it without title, without expectation of reward, are very often the ones who deserve, more than anyone else in the room, to be truly seen. And perhaps that is what stays with us longest from an evening like this one, not the unkindness, which fades quickly enough, but the quiet decency of someone who simply chose to look a little closer. We do not always know, walking through a door tired and travel-worn, who will see us clearly and who will not. But it is worth remembering that the kindness we receive in our hardest, most ordinary moments, offered freely by someone expecting nothing in return, is very often the thing we carry longest, long after the rest of the evening has been forgotten. If this story moved you, that's exactly the kind of story StorySphere is here to tell. Subscribe and stay with us because the next one might just be better.